Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something a little unnerving: psychological manipulation.
It's a topic that's definitely relevant to everyone. I mean, who hasn't encountered some form of manipulation, either as the manipulator or the one being manipulated?
Right. I think we all have those moments.
Yeah.
And that's why we're diving deep into this topic today. We're going to be pulling insights from Wikipedia's definition of manipulation. And then we have some expert opinions on the tactics manipulators use, the vulnerabilities they exploit, and even some research that connects manipulation to something called overconfidence.
We've got a lot to unpack, so let's get right to it. Shall we start with defining what manipulation actually is?
Yeah, let's lay that groundwork first. What's the official definition?
Well, according to Wikipedia, manipulation is about influencing or controlling someone unfairly to achieve your own goals. And the key word here is unfairly. It sets it apart from general persuasion or influence.
Right, because manipulation isn't just about convincing someone to do something. It's about doing it in a way that's, well, manipulative, exploiting their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities to get what you want.
Exactly. And Wikipedia even lists some pretty intense methods manipulators might use, like, seduction, suggestion, coercion, and even blackmail.
Okay, so we're not just talking about subtle hints or gentle nudges here. This can get pretty dark.
It can, absolutely. But it's important to remember that manipulation often operates in more subtle ways, too. Psychologist Harriet Breker identified a whole range of manipulation tactics, and you'd be surprised how many of them we encounter in everyday life.
Let's dive into those tactics. I'm curious to hear what they are. One that jumped out at me from our prep materials was positive reinforcement. Like, on the surface, encouragement and praise seem like good things. So how does that become manipulative?
It all comes down to intent. Think about someone who's constantly showering you with excessive praise, maybe going overboard with gifts or being overly charming. It might feel good at first, but are they genuinely trying to be kind? Or are they trying to create a sense of obligation to make you feel like you owe them something in return?
Ah, I see. It's like that saying, beware of Greeks bearing gifts. You're being buttered up, but there's an ulterior motive lurking beneath the surface. Man, makes me think of all those times I fell for that kind of charm offensive.
Happens to the best of us. And recognizing these tactics is the first step in protecting ourselves. Now, here's another tactic that works on the principle of reward, but in reverse negative reinforcement.
Okay, how does that work?
Picture this. Someone gives you the silent treatment, right? They withdraw their affection, making you feel isolated and insecure.
Right.
Then, as soon as you give in to their demands, bam, they're suddenly all loving and warm again.
Oh, wow, that's a classic move, isn't it?
Oh.
It's almost like they're training you, making you crave their approval, even though they're the ones creating the negativity in the first place.
Exactly. And speaking of training, there's another tactic straight out of the animal behavior playbook: intermittent reinforcement. Like how they train dogs. They don't get a treat every time they do a trick, just every once in a while.
So you're saying it's like someone is giving you inconsistent affection or approval, keeping you off balance and constantly trying to please them. That's a messed up game.
It is, unfortunately. But we should probably move on to a tactic that I think is even more insidious: gaslighting.
Ooh, yeah, gaslighting. That one always creeps me out. It sounds like something straight out of a psychological thriller.
It can feel that way. Because with gaslighting, it's all about distorting reality, making the victim doubt their own perceptions and memories. It can be as subtle as denying something they said, or even as blatant as, planting false evidence.
It's like they're trying to drive you crazy, make you question your own sanity. That's terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give an example? How might this play out in a relationship?
Sure. Let's say you tell your partner they hurt your feelings with something they said. Now, a gaslighter might deny ever saying it, insist you're misremembering, or even accuse you of being too sensitive. Over time, this can really mess with your head.
Wow, yeah. It's like they're slowly eroding your sense of self, making you more and more dependent on them for validation. Scary stuff. So we've talked about positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, intermittent reinforcement, and gaslighting. What else is in the manipulator's toolbox?
Well, there's the more, let's call it overt tactic of punishment, using negative consequences to control behavior. Yelling, threats, guilt trips, anything to make the victim feel bad enough to comply.
Yeah, that kind of manipulation is a little harder to miss, I think. It's more in your face, aggressive, even abusive in some cases.
Absolutely. And even one instance of that kind of behavior can leave a lasting impact. Breaker actually calls this traumatic one-trial learning. Like, one explosive outburst of rage or intimidation is enough to condition the victim into avoiding conflict with the manipulator.
So it's like they've established dominance through fear, and you're constantly walking on eggshells, terrified to set them off again. This has been really eye-opening. Makes me wonder, though, if these tactics are so effective, does that mean everyone is equally vulnerable to being manipulated?
That's a great question. And thankfully, the answer is no. While anyone can be manipulated under the right circumstances, manipulators tend to target individuals with specific vulnerabilities.
Okay, so there are certain buttons manipulators look for. And by buttons, we mean like personality traits. Like, are some people just naturally more prone to being manipulated than others?
Right. And one of the biggest buttons is people pleasing. Those who have a deep need for approval, who hate to disappoint others, those are prime targets for manipulators. They're easily swayed by flattery, guilt trips, even the threat of withdrawal.
Makes sense. If someone is constantly seeking validation, then a manipulator can dangle that approval like a carrot on a stick, using it to control their behavior. What other buttons do they look for?
People who fear negative emotions are another easy target. If you hate conflict or expressing anger, a manipulator can really control you, like with the silent treatment or threats. You're more likely to just give in to their demands to avoid those uncomfortable feelings.
It's almost like they're holding your emotions hostage. So what we're saying is that avoidance becomes the coping mechanism, even if it means sacrificing your own needs and boundaries in the process.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's exactly what happens. And another big vulnerability is a weak sense of self. Maybe you have poor boundaries, low self-esteem. Those are things that make you much more susceptible to manipulation.
It's like manipulators prey on our insecurities, using them to control us and get what they want. This makes it so important to work on building up our inner strength and resilience. But I'm curious about the manipulators themselves now. Why do people manipulate? Is it always because they're just bad people?
Well, it can be. Some people genuinely have a deep need for power and control. And they get a sense of superiority from manipulating others.
Right, that classic villain archetype, the power-hungry, ruthless manipulator.
Exactly. But it's not always that straightforward. Sometimes there are other, less obvious motivations at play. Like sometimes it's about a hidden agenda.
Like what?
It could be something like achieving a specific goal, maybe financial gains, securing a certain outcome in negotiation, or even just avoiding responsibility for their actions. It's not always about controlling the person per se, but about controlling the situation to get what they want.
So it could be like a business deal where someone manipulates their partner to get a bigger share of the profits. Or maybe a friend who uses manipulation to like get a coveted invitation to an event. It's not necessarily driven by pure malice, but by this calculated desire to achieve a specific outcome.
Exactly. And then sometimes manipulation isn't even a conscious decision. It could be more about emotional suppression. People who have trouble dealing with their own emotions.
So instead of facing their own insecurities or uncomfortable feelings head on, they try to control their emotional environment by manipulating the people around them. That's really interesting.
Right. And then you have the factor of impulsivity, a lack of self-control, where someone might manipulate preemptively, trying to control a situation before it controls them, even if it's not the most rational or ethical approach.
It's like they're acting out of fear or anxiety, trying to manipulate their way into a sense of safety, even if it creates more chaos in the long run. You know what else I found really interesting? That research paper you shared on overconfidence. It really made me think about how our own perceptions, our own beliefs about ourselves can actually make us more vulnerable to manipulation.
It's a fascinating connection, isn't it? The paper showed that people tend to overestimate their abilities on hard tasks and underestimate others even more, which leads to this illusion of being better than average. And that can make us prime targets for manipulation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you're already walking around thinking you're smarter or more capable than everyone else, you might be more likely to fall for manipulators' tricks.
They can play into that inflated ego, using flattery or even pretending to be less intelligent to gain your trust and then exploit it. It's like they're holding up a funhouse mirror, reflecting back a distorted image of yourself that you want to believe.
So how do we protect ourselves from falling for these traps? How do we actually spot manipulation in action?
Well, one of the biggest red flags is inconsistency. Does someone's actions match their words? Are they overly charming, almost too good to be true? Are they trying to isolate you from your support network? These are all warning signs.
Okay, so we need to trust our gut, be wary of inconsistencies, and pay attention to those red flags. But how do we deal with a manipulator once we've identified them?
That's what we'll dive into next time.
So we've uncovered some of those sneaky manipulation tactics. Makes you wonder who's most likely to fall prey to this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely not random. I mean, manipulators, they tend to target individuals with specific vulnerabilities. It's not like they just throw these tactics out there and hope something sticks.
Right. Like the Wikipedia article mentioned some characteristics that make someone more susceptible. It mentioned
Mm.
dependency and immaturity.
Yeah, definitely. Think about it. If someone is still developing their sense of self, they might be more reliant on others for approval or
Mhm.
direction, and that can make them more vulnerable to manipulation.
Like if you're still figuring out who you are, it's easier for someone to come in and kind of mold you into what they want, right?
Yeah.
Especially I think with things like advertising or peer
It's
pressure.
exactly if you're not yet comfortable, asserting your own needs or saying no, it's easier to just kind of go along with what others want, even if it's not in your best interest.
Makes sense. And, one group that the article specifically called out as being a frequent target of manipulators is the elderly, which is really sad to think about.
Mhm. Yeah, it's heartbreaking, to be honest. Manipulators often prey on older individuals, exploiting, maybe fatigue, difficulty with multitasking, or even cognitive decline.
Yeah. It makes you realize that manipulation isn't just this, one-on-one power dynamic. It can actually be a systemic issue with
Right.
whole groups of people being targeted based on their perceived vulnerabilities.
Right. It's something to be really mindful of. And speaking of vulnerabilities, the article also talked about personality traits. Like it mentioned how narcissism can actually make someone more susceptible to manipulation.
Wait, really? I would think that someone with a big ego would be less likely to be manipulated.
Yeah.
They think they're so smart and all-knowing.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But here's the thing. Narcissists, while they might seem, totally self-assured on the surface, they're often driven by a deep need for admiration, validation, and a skilled manipulator can use that. Feed that ego, use flattery.
Ah, so it's like they're reflecting back that inflated self-image that the narcissist has, making them feel even more important and special, which then makes them let their guard down.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about playing to their need for validation. But here's another interesting point the article made. It said that being too altruistic can also make you a target, too empathetic.
Really? That doesn't make sense. I thought like kindness and compassion would be, protective factors, not
Well,
vulnerabilities.
yeah, you'd think so. But remember those buttons we were talking about, those emotional pressure points?
Yeah.
Well, for someone who's naturally trusting and compassionate, that button might be like their desire to help others. Their empathy.
So a manipulator might play the victim, maybe exaggerate their problems or even make up stories to get your sympathy.
Hmm.
And because you're so empathetic, you find it hard to say no, even if something feels off.
Exactly. It's like they're weaponizing your empathy, using your good nature against you, which is why it's so important to be aware of these tendencies in ourselves.
Right. Like even our best qualities can be used against us if we're not careful. It's kind of scary to think about. Makes me want to just like build a wall around myself and never trust anyone.
Well, it's not about becoming completely distrustful, but it is about being aware, understanding your own vulnerabilities. Those buttons that might make you more susceptible to certain types of influence.
For sure. And one of those vulnerabilities, I think, might be impulsivity,
Mm.
right? Like people who tend to make snap decisions
Mm-hmm.
without really thinking things through.
Yeah, that can definitely make you more vulnerable. It's like they haven't really developed those critical thinking skills that help us pause, evaluate a
Yeah.
situation, and really see those red flags before we make a choice.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like we need to learn how to slow down, to hit the pause button and really assess things before we jump in.
Exactly. It's about cultivating awareness, being able to step back from a situation and ask yourself, okay, is this what it seems? Are my boundaries being respected? Am I being pressured into something that I'm not comfortable with?
Those are such good questions to ask ourselves, really good food for thought. So it seems like self-awareness is really, truly crucial in recognizing and resisting manipulation.
It really is. It's a journey of understanding ourselves, our
Yeah.
triggers, our weaknesses, and then developing strategies to protect ourselves.
Okay, so how do we embark on that journey? Like, where do we even begin? Welcome back to the deep dive. We spent the last two parts of this deep dive really getting into the nitty-gritty of psychological manipulation. And I got to say, it's been a little unnerving. Makes you realize how much of this stuff is going on around us.
It is. It's one of those things that once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I keep coming back to something you said earlier about how self-awareness is key to resisting manipulation.
Yeah.
So how do we actually put that into practice? Like, what are the concrete steps we can take to become more aware, to protect
It's
ourselves?
a great question because it's one thing to understand manipulation intellectually, but it's another thing to actually apply that knowledge in real life.
Right, like it's kind of like having a map but not knowing how to read it. You can see all the landmarks and the roads,
Right.
but if you don't have the skills to actually navigate, you're going to get lost.
Exactly. So let's talk about those navigational skills, those practical steps we can take to become more aware, more discerning. And one of the most important things, and it might sound deceptively simple, but it's to to really pay attention to your gut feelings. Something feels off. In an interaction, if a person's behavior is making you uncomfortable, trust those instincts.
It's like that little voice inside that whispers, oh, something's not right here. But sometimes we ignore that voice, right? We tell ourselves, oh, I'm just being paranoid or I'm overreacting.
It's easy to do, especially if you're someone who's naturally trusting or conflict avoidant. But those gut feelings, they're often red flags, like signals from our subconscious saying, hey, pay attention, something's not quite right here.
So how do we figure out if our gut is giving us accurate information? Like, what does that investigation look like?
Well, one helpful strategy is to get an outside perspective. Talk to a trusted friend or family member, someone who can listen objectively, without judgment. Just describe the situation and how it's making you feel.
Yeah, sometimes just saying things out loud, hearing yourself articulate those feelings, it can help you see things more clearly. And then, hearing someone else's take on the situation can either validate your perceptions or maybe even challenge them if you're misinterpreting things.
Right. It's like having a sounding board,
Yeah.
to bounce ideas off of. Make sure you're not getting caught in a loop of self-doubt or denial. But beyond just checking in with others, another crucial piece of the self-awareness puzzle is understanding and honoring your own boundaries.
Right, boundaries. Boundaries are so important in any relationship, but especially when it comes to protecting yourself from manipulation.
Hmm.
It's just that setting those boundaries, that can be tricky, right? Especially if you're someone who's, used to people pleasing or
It,
avoiding conflict.
it can be. It can be tough, but it's essential because it's about recognizing your own worth and refusing to let others walk all over you. Start by asking yourself, what am I comfortable with? What are my non-negotiables? What are the behaviors that are just absolutely unacceptable to me?
So once you have a sense of those boundaries, then it's about communicating them, right? Clearly and confidently. I imagine that can feel awkward at first.
It can. It definitely can, but it gets easier with practice, I promise. And remember, it's okay to say no to requests or demands that make you feel uncomfortable or that violate those boundaries you've set.
No, such a simple word, but so powerful.
Oh.
It's about taking back control,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Refusing to be manipulated into doing things that, don't align with your values.
Exactly. And along with those boundaries, it can also be helpful to practice being more assertive.
Assertive. Now, that doesn't mean aggressive,
Yeah,
right?
no, not at all. Assertiveness is not about being aggressive or domineering. It's about communicating your needs and your opinions clearly,
Mm.
respectfully.
Right. So it's about finding that sweet spot
Yeah.
between being a pushover and being a bulldozer, standing your ground, but still being mindful of other people's feelings.
Exactly. It's about respecting yourself and others simultaneously. And just like setting those boundaries, assertiveness is a muscle. It gets stronger the more you use it. So the more you practice, the more comfortable you'll become. Expressing your needs, standing up for yourself.
Okay, so far we've got trusting our gut, getting outside perspectives, setting boundaries, and practicing assertiveness. What other tools can we add to our self-awareness toolkit?
Well, another really important element is being mindful of our emotional state. When we're feeling stressed, anxious, we're just depleted. We're much more vulnerable to manipulation. Our defenses are down, and we're more likely to make those impulsive decisions or to give in to demands that we wouldn't normally agree to.
It's like, when you're running on fumes, you're more likely to reach for that sugary snack or skip your workout, even though you know it's not good for you.
Right, exactly. It's the same with manipulation. When our emotional reserves are low, we're more easily swayed. So prioritizing self-care, it's crucial. Making sure you're getting enough sleep, eating nourishing foods, moving your body, engaging in activities that bring you joy, replenish your energy.
It's a good reminder that self-care isn't selfish. It's essential. It's about equipping ourselves.
Yeah.
with the strength and resilience, we need to navigate those challenges of life, including those tricky interpersonal situations that might involve manipulation.
Exactly. You can't pour from an empty cup, as they say. But even with all the self-awareness and the self-care, we're still bound to encounter those manipulators.
Yeah.
From time to time. So the question is, what do we do? How do we handle it effectively when we find ourselves in that situation?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? It's like knowing all the moves in a martial art, but then freezing up when someone actually attacks you.
It happens. It takes practice and courage, to really stand up to a manipulator. But remember all those tactics we unpacked earlier. Once you recognize that someone is using them, like that positive reinforcement or the gaslighting, the punishment, you can actually call them out on it.
So it's not about, like, being confrontational.
No, not necessarily. It's more about, just assertively pointing out that behavior. You could say something like, I feel pressured by this approach, or I'm not comfortable with the way you're speaking to me.
And what if they deny it? Or try to, like, gaslight you into thinking you're imagining things?
Then you disengage. You don't have to play their game. You don't have to get sucked into their drama.
It's like that saying, not my circus, not my monkeys.
Exactly. And, if you're dealing with someone who's a persistent manipulator, someone who repeatedly disrespects your boundaries, tries to control you, it might be time to reevaluate that relationship.
Yeah, that's a tough call. But sometimes it's necessary. You have to protect your own well-being. You don't have to tolerate that kind of toxic behavior, no matter who it's coming from.
You're absolutely right. And remember, you deserve to be treated with respect, kindness. Don't let anyone make you feel less than that.
This whole conversation has been really eye-opening. I feel like I've learned so much about manipulation, all the subtle ways it can operate, and the steps we can take to protect ourselves. But it also makes you think about the other side of the coin. Are we all capable of manipulation? Under the right circumstances?
That's a really profound question, and it speaks to the complexity of human nature.
Right.
I mean, we all have the capacity for good and bad, for manipulation and for genuine connection.
It's like that saying, the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every human being.
Exactly. And that's why self-awareness is so crucial. It's about recognizing those tendencies within ourselves, those moments when we might be tempted to exploit someone's vulnerabilities or, to twist the truth to our advantage.
So it's not just about protecting ourselves from being manipulated. It's also about making sure we're not the ones doing the manipulating. It's about, taking responsibility.
Yeah, all the hater.
And striving to build relationships that are based on trust and respect.
Absolutely. And that leads to a really important question, I think. In a world where manipulation is becoming, more and more sophisticated, how can we use this knowledge to promote ethical persuasion and build genuine connection?
That's a great question. I think this starts with being really mindful of our intentions, being transparent in our communication, and respecting other people's autonomy, their right to make their own choices. True influence, I think, comes from authenticity and connection, not coercion or control.
I love that. Beautifully said. And remember, this deep dive, it's just the beginning.
Yeah.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving to be a force for good in the world.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. How can you use your knowledge of manipulation to become a more ethical influencer, a more conscious communicator, a more empowered individual? Until next time, stay curious and stay connected.